Nobody on Palara Ring had ever smelled hickory smoke before. That would change soon enough, but on the day Russ Hadley dragged his battered steel smoker through the docking port, the only thing the station smelled like was recycled air and faintly sweet pollen from the O'Reilly breathing gardens. Two customs officers, tall, translucent beings with skin like frosted glass, scanned his cargo crate 3 times before they believed what was inside. Preserved animal tissue. One of them read off the display. She looked at Russ the way someone might look at a man carrying a bag of spiders onto a bus. Beef ribs, Russ corrected gently. Bone-in, ethically sourced. They let him through. Barely. The Galactic Nutrition Summit happened once every standard cycle. Hundreds of species sent their finest minds to discuss food science, dietary evolution, and the philosophy of consumption. It was prestigious, intellectual, and very, very polite. Most of the galaxy had moved past eating flesh a long time ago. Herbivores, fungivores, photosynthesizers, energy absorbers, the civilized species had civilized diets. Meat eating was something they read about in old history texts, right next to tribal warfare and planetary pollution. Humanity had earned its seat at the table only recently. Earth's government, eager to make a good impression, had sent Russ, a field biologist, survival instructor, and, most importantly, a man who could cook a rack of ribs that would make a grown person weep. He had not been their first choice. He had been their fourth. The first 3 had read the summit's cultural guidelines and politely declined. Russ read the same guidelines, laughed, and started packing. His assigned liaison was a Myvery named Pico. The Myvery were insectoid, about waist-high to a human, with shiny brown shells and large, worried eyes. Pico had 6 legs and used 4 of them to nervously tap the floor as he led Russ to his quarters. "You are the Earth delegate," Pico said, reading from his tablet. "Your registered dietary classification is omnivore, active predator lineage." He paused. "Is that correct?" "That's us," Russ said. "I see." Pico tapped faster. The welcome reception that evening was held in the station's grand atrium, a domed space filled with floating light orbs and long tables of species-appropriate refreshments. Russ grabbed something that looked like a cracker made of compressed flowers. It tasted like nothing. He ate 3 anyway, because he was polite. The O'Reilly delegation dominated the room. They were the summit's hosts this cycle, elegant, 8-foot-tall beings who moved like water and spoke like wind through chimes. Their ambassador, a graceful figure named Selani, gave the opening address from a raised platform. She spoke about progress, about how the galaxy had elevated itself beyond crude survival, about how diet reflected the soul of civilization. Then she smiled, thin and precise, and added, "Of course, we welcome all species to this summit, even those who have not yet outgrown the urge to chew on carcasses." Scattered laughter rippled through the crowd. A few heads turned toward Russ. He was the only human on the station. Russ raised his flour cracker in a small toast and kept chewing. Over the next hour, he introduced himself to a dozen delegations. The reactions were consistent. Polite smiles that didn't reach the eyes. Quick glances at his teeth, flat in the front, but with canines that no herbivore species possessed. One delegate, a cloud-like Dranavi, actually drifted backward when Russ extended his hand. "You are a predator species, yes?" the Dranavi asked, its form rippling with unease. "We started that way," Russ said. "Nowadays we mostly argue about pizza toppings." The Dranavi did not understand the joke. It drifted away. Only one group showed any warmth. Near the back of the atrium, a cluster of stocky, reptilian beings sat together, drinking quietly. The Garati. They had thick, scaled hides, heavy tails, and tired eyes. Their elder, a scarred veteran named Duro, watched Russ from across the room with an expression that was hard to read. Russ nodded to him. Duro nodded back. Neither spoke. Before the reception ended, Russ signed Earth up for the grand tasting exhibition, the summit's final event, where each species prepared their signature dish for everyone to sample and judge. The registration clerk stared at his entry form. "You are submitting smoked animal ribs." "Smoked beef ribs," Russ said, low and slow. 12-hour cook. This will be consumed in public. That's the idea. The clerk processed the form without another word, but Russ noticed her fingers trembling. Back in his quarters, Russ unpacked the crate. Vacuum-sealed racks of beef ribs, hickory wood chips, his dry rub blend in a mason jar, a spray bottle for the apple cider vinegar spritz, and a roll of butcher paper. He laid everything out on the counter with the care of a surgeon preparing instruments. Pico stood in the doorway, watching. "That is, the animal?" Pico asked quietly. "Part of one," Russ said. "A cow. Good animal. Fed well, lived well. And you'll burn it. Smoke it. There's a difference." Russ smiled. "You'll see." Pico's legs tapped a rapid, anxious rhythm on the floor. But he didn't leave. He stood there, watching as Russ hummed an old song to himself and sorted wood chips by size, calm as a man tending a garden. Outside the quarters, Paulara Ring hummed with the quiet conversations of 1,000 species who had never questioned what civilized meant. That was about to change. The lecture hall smelled like lavender and ozone, which apparently was what intellectual superiority smelled like on Paulara Ring. Russ sat in the third row, arms crossed, listening to a gaseous Dranavi philosopher named Ulys deliver the summit's keynote address. The title of the talk was Consumption and Conscience. Why what you eat defines what you are. It was exactly as bad as it sounded. Ulys floated above the podium like a slow-moving storm cloud, his voice deep and resonant, filling the chamber without effort. He spoke about the evolution of species through their diets, how herbivores developed patience, community, and empathy, how fungivores cultivated introspection and long-term thinking, how energy absorbers achieved a state of pure mental clarity, and then he got to predators, species that evolved through the consumption of other living creatures. Ulys said, his cloudy form darkening slightly, carry within them a fundamental neurological limitation. The predator brain is wired for dominance, for taking, for violence. It is, by its very nature, incapable of true empathy. A murmur of agreement passed through the audience. Several delegates glanced back at Russ. Russ raised his hand. Ulys paused, clearly not used to being interrupted. "The Earth delegate wishes to speak." "Just a question," Russ said, standing. On Earth, the act of hunting and cooking meat together was one of the first things that built social bonds between early humans. Sharing a fire, sharing food. That's where language started, where families became communities. Our predator history didn't make us less empathetic. It made cooperation a survival skill. The hall was silent for a moment. Selani, the Urali ambassador, stood from her seat near the front. "A predator justifying predation," she said smoothly. "How surprising." Laughter. Thin, polite, and cutting. Russ sat down. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. Not yet. The next 2 days followed the same pattern. Every panel, every workshop, every casual conversation in the hallways, the reaction was the same. Curiosity mixed with disgust. Politeness layered over contempt. One Bravani delegate, a four-legged canine species with silver fur, actually crossed to the other side of a corridor when she saw Russ coming. Pico stayed close, though. The little Myvory was still nervous around Russ, still flinched whenever Russ mentioned cooking. But he was dutiful. He guided Russ to every session, translated when needed, and made sure his quarters were stocked with the filtered water Russ had requested point one evening. Walking back from a panel on synthetic nutrition, Russ asked Pico a simple question. "Do your people eat together? Like, sit around a table, share a meal?" Pico's antennae twitched. "No, Myvory consume nutrients in private pods. Eating is personal, private." Huh? Russ was quiet for a moment. "On Earth, eating together is one of the most important things we do. Birthdays, holidays, regular Tuesday nights, you sit down, you pass the food around, you talk. My dad used to fire up the grill every Sunday. Neighbors would come over, kids running around the yard. It wasn't about the food, really. It was about being there." Pico said nothing, but his legs slowed their nervous tapping. "We call it cookout," Russ continued, "or barbecue. Depends on where you're from. And the food at this barbecue, it is meat. Sometimes it's corn on the cob. Sometimes it's potato salad that someone's aunt made wrong, but nobody says anything because she's sweet. Russ smiled at a memory. The meat's just the reason everyone shows up. The rest is what matters. Pico processed this quietly. They walked the rest of the way in silence. The next morning, Russ found someone waiting outside his quarters. Duro, the Garati elder. Up close, the old reptilian was imposing. Nearly as tall as Russ, twice as broad, his green-brown scales crossed with pale scars. His eyes, though, were soft, almost sad. "May I speak with you?" Duro asked. Russ let him in. They sat across from each other at the small table. Duro didn't touch the water Russ offered. He just stared at the sealed crate of ribs in the corner for a long time. "The Garati were omnivores once," Duro said finally. "Before we joined the Galactic Assembly, we hunted. We cooked over open flame. We smoked meat in great stone houses that our grandmothers built. What happened? We were told it was primitive, unworthy of a civilized species." Duro's heavy tail shifted on the floor. "So we stopped. We burned the smokehouses. We changed our diets. We taught our children that what their ancestors did was shameful." Russ said nothing. He just listened. "I have not tasted cooked meat since I was a hatchling," Duro said. His voice was low, rough, almost a whisper. "My grandmother gave me a piece of roasted flank, still warm. I remember the taste. I remember the fire. I remember her face." He paused. "I remember everything." The silence between them was heavy. Not awkward, just heavy. "I saw your entry for the grand tasting," Duro said. "You were going to cook in front of all of them." "I am. Selani has filed a motion to disqualify you. On ethical grounds." Russ leaned back in his chair. "Yeah, I heard. The committee votes tomorrow." "I know." Duro looked at him for a long moment. "You are not afraid." Russ shook his head. "I've been told my whole life that what I eat is wrong, that how I eat is wrong, that my people are less because of it. I came here to cook some ribs. That's exactly what I'm going to do." Duro stood slowly. At the door, he paused without turning around. "Good," he said quietly, and left. That night, the committee received 47 messages from various delegations, some demanding Russ be removed, others demanding he be allowed to compete. The vote would be close. The committee voted 7-5 in Russ Hadley's favor, and Selani nearly shattered the glass podium with the force of her open palm. The vote took place in the summit's council chamber, a circular room with floating seats arranged in tiers, soft blue lighting, and acoustics designed so that even a whisper could reach every corner. Russ wasn't allowed inside during deliberations, so he waited in the hallway with Pico, eating something that tasted like a rice cake made of sadness. When the doors opened and the result was announced, Pico exhaled so hard his antennae wobbled. Russ just nodded. But Selani wasn't finished. She stepped into the corridor, her translucent skin flushed with faint color, the Orally equivalent of fury. She was taller than Russ by a full head, and she used every inch of that height as she looked down at him. "The charter protects you," she said, her voice like cracking ice. "But do not think this is acceptance. You want to parade your barbarism in front of civilized beings? Then do it properly. No hiding behind sauces and seasonings. No clever presentation. I want every delegate in that hall to see exactly what a meat-eater does. Every cut, every bite, every bone." Russ looked at her calmly. "Deal. I want them to see the animal. They'll see it. I want them to watch you eat it with your hands. Wouldn't have it any other way." Selani's jaw tightened. She had expected resistance, maybe even fear. Instead, she got a man who looked like he'd just been invited to a Sunday afternoon in his own backyard. "Then we understand each other," she said, and walked away. Russ watched her go, then turned to Pico. "She just made my job a lot easier." "How?" Pico asked, bewildered. "She wanted to show. I was going to give them a meal. Now I can give them both." Word spread across Paulara Ring within hours. The human delegate had accepted a public challenge. He would break down a full bone-in rack, smoke it in the open exhibition hall, and eat it in front of everyone, including cracking the bones for marrow. What had been a minor line item on the grand tasting schedule was now the most anticipated event of the entire summit. News drones from 12 systems requested broadcast access. Delegations that had never bothered attending the tasting were suddenly reserving seats. The exhibition hall's capacity was expanded twice, and there was still a waiting list. Russ spent the next day building his setup. He had brought the smoker, a barrel-style offset he'd welded himself back in Texas. It was dented, blackened, and ugly in the way that only well-loved equipment can be. He set it up in the center of the exhibition floor, surrounded by gleaming alien food stations that looked like they belonged in a museum. His station looked like it belonged in a parking lot. He didn't care. Pico helped. The little Mivory had officially moved beyond nervous tolerance into something closer to genuine curiosity. He carried wood chips, adjusted vent positions, and held tools that he didn't understand while Russ explained what each one did. "This is the firebox," Russ said, pointing. "The wood burns here. The smoke travels through this chamber, where the meat sits. Low heat, indirect. That's the secret. You don't blast it. You let the smoke do the work." "How long?" Pico asked. 12 hours. Maybe 14. You will cook for 14 hours. Good barbecue takes time. You can't rush it. The collagen in the meat needs to break down slowly. The fat renders. The bark forms on the outside. That's the crust, the flavor layer. If you try to speed it up, you ruin it. Pico tilted his head. "It sounds like patience." "It is patience. That's the whole thing." Other delegates wandered through the exhibition hall as Russ worked. Most kept their distance, watching from the edges like visitors at a strange zoo. But some came closer. A pair of Bravani, the canine species, circled the smoker twice, their noses twitching. A young Garati stopped and stared at the wood chips for a full minute before walking away without a word, and questions came. Not hostile ones, curious ones. "What kind of wood is that?" "Hickory. Gives a strong, sweet smoke." "Why do you wrap the meat in paper?" "Holds in moisture during the stall. That's when the internal temperature plateaus. The paper lets it push through without drying out." "Is it true you will eat the bones?" "The marrow inside them. You crack the bone, and the marrow is soft, rich, like butter." Early humans survived on marrow. It's one of the oldest foods our species ever ate. Russ answered every question the same way. Simply, honestly, without shame or apology. That evening, Duro came to the exhibition hall. He stood beside Russ for a long time, watching him arrange the wood in the firebox, adjusting the airflow. "Do you understand what you are doing?" Duro asked quietly. "Cooking ribs," Russ said. "No." Duro shook his heavy head. "You're standing up for every species that was told what they eat makes them lesser. Every people who buried their traditions to earn a seat they should never have had to beg for." Russ stopped what he was doing. He looked at Duro, really looked at him. The old scars, the tired eyes, the weight of a culture carried alone. "Yeah," Russ said. "I know. That's why I'm not going to hold back. Not one bit." Duro placed one heavy, scaled hand on Russ's shoulder. He said nothing more. He didn't need it at 8 dawn the next day, 12 hours before the grand tasting. Russ lit the fire. Hickory chips caught. Smoke curled from the stack. A thin blue haze drifted upward, found the station's ventilation system, and began to spread. Across Paulara Ring, in corridors and quarters and meditation pods, aliens stopped what they were doing. Something unfamiliar had entered the air. Something warm, something ancient, something that tugged at instincts they didn't know they had. Some wrinkled their noses and turned away, but others breathed in deep and didn't know why they couldn't stop. The smoke reached the exhibition hall's upper balconies before Russ even opened the lid point. 3,000 delegates filled the tiered seating. Another 5,000 watched on screens throughout the station. News drones hovered above the floor like patient insects, their tiny lenses catching every angle. In the history of the Galactic Nutrition Summit, no single event had ever drawn this kind of crowd. The exhibition floor was arranged in a wide circle. Each species had a station, polished, pristine, glowing with careful design. The orally presented luminescent algae cakes that changed color based on the eater's emotional state. The Mivory displayed crystallized fungal towers that chimed when touched. The Dranavi offered photon-infused nectar served in vessels that floated on magnetic fields. Every station was beautiful. Every station was quiet. Then Russ wheeled out the smoker. The barrel rolled across the polished floor with a low rumble. Russ positioned it at his station, A bare metal table with a cutting board, a knife, and a roll of butcher paper. No lights, no floating vessels, no decoration. That he put on a pair of heat-resistant gloves, gripped the smoker's handle, and looked out at the silent crowd. 12 hours, he said, his voice carrying through the hall's perfect acoustics. Low and slow. He opened the lid. Smoke poured out in a thick, rolling wave, not gray, but blue-white with a golden edge. It caught the overhead lights and turned them amber. The smell hit the hall like a living thing. Rich, deep, sweet, layered with wood and fat, and something primal that no species in that room had a word for. The reaction was immediate. Some delegates recoiled, covering their breathing openings. Others froze, wide-eyed. A group of Bravani near the front row leaned forward involuntarily, their noses working before their brains could stop them. Inside the smoker, the ribs sat on the grate in a perfect row. They were deep mahogany, almost black at the edges, glistening where the fat had rendered down and glazed the surface. The bark had formed perfectly, cracked in thin lines that revealed moist, pink meat beneath. Russ lifted the rack with both hands and placed it on the cutting board. The weight of it settled with a soft thud. He picked up his knife, a simple, worn blade, and began a slice that he didn't rush. Each cut followed the bone. The meat separated from the ribs in clean, heavy portions, barely needing pressure. Juice pooled on the butcher paper, dark, fragrant, warm. Russ narrated as he worked, his voice calm and steady. This is beef. From a cow, a domesticated animal on Earth. This one was raised on a ranch in open pasture. Grass-fed, good life. He separated another rib. When we cook an animal, we use everything we can. The meat, the fat, the bones, the marrow. Wasting any part of it would be disrespectful to the creature that provided it. The hall was completely silent. Even the news drones seemed to hold still. Russ picked up a rib with his bare hands. No fork, no utensil, just fingers wrapped around bone. The way humans had done it for 100,000 years, he bit into it. The sound was small, but it carried. Teeth through bark into tender meat, the faint pull of flesh from bone. Russ chewed slowly, eyes half closed, and something crossed his face that every species in that room could recognize. Satisfaction, he finished the rib, set the clean bone down, and picked up another. Then he did something Selani had specifically demanded. He cracked a bone. He gripped it in both hands and snapped it. The sound echoed through the hall, sharp, definitive. Several delegates flinched. Selani, seated in the front row, stared with undisguised horror. Russ held up the broken bone so the crowd could see the marrow inside. Soft, creamy, pale against the dark exterior. Bone marrow, he said. One of the first foods early humans ever ate. Before we had tools sharp enough to cut meat, we cracked bones with rocks to get to this. It's rich in fat and nutrients. Some scientists believe it's the food that fueled the growth of the human brain. He scooped the marrow out with his finger and ate it. Nobody breathed. Russ continued eating. Rib after rib. Steady. Unhurried. He didn't perform. He didn't gloat. He ate the way a man eats when he's done this 1,000 times. At backyard cookouts, at family tables, alone on a porch watching the sun go down. He ate like it was the most natural thing in the world because it was some delegates stood and left. A cluster of orali near the exits departed in visible distress. A Dranavi philosopher deflated slightly and drifted toward the door, but others stayed and watched, and something shifted in their eyes. The Garati section was still. Every single one of them sat rigid, their tails flat against the floor, their eyes locked on Russ. Duro sat in the center, his scarred hands gripping his knees. 15 minutes passed. Russ was halfway through the rack. Clean bones piled on the butcher paper like a quiet monument. Then movement. From the Garati section, a young female stood up. She was smaller than the others, her scales a lighter green, her eyes wide and bright. Asha, a junior delegate, barely old enough to attend. She walked down the steps. Across the floor, past the floating nectar and the crystal towers and the color-changing cakes. She stopped in front of Russ's table. The hall held its breath. "May I try a piece?" she asked. Her voice was small, but it did not shake. Russ looked at her. He didn't make a speech. He didn't hesitate. He picked up a clean rib, a good one, with plenty of meat, and held it out. "Help yourself," he said. Asha took the rib. She looked at it, turned it in her clawed hand. Then she bit into it. Her eyes closed. Her tail curled upward, slowly, like a question finding its answer. She chewed, swallowed, and took another bite. In the garrote section, Duro's grip on his knees tightened until his scales turned white. Nobody said a word. Asha did not sit back down. She stood at Russ's station, eating quietly, and the entire galaxy watched a young garrote remember something her species had been told to forget. It took 4 minutes for the next person to stand up. An older garrote male, broad-shouldered, his scales dull with age. He walked down from the upper tier without looking at anyone. He stopped beside Asha, glanced at Russ, and said nothing. Russ handed him a rib. The old male bit into it, and his eyes went somewhere far away. Then 2 more garrote. Then 3 then a Bravani. She was the silver-furred delegate who had crossed the corridor to avoid Russ 2 days earlier. She walked to the station on all 4 legs, her ears flat against her skull, and asked for a small piece. Russ cut her a portion and placed it on the butcher paper in front of her. She ate it delicately, eyes darting around the room, as if waiting to be punished. Nobody punished her. So she ate another piece. Within an hour, there were over 30 beings at Russ's station. Not all of them ate. Some just watched. Some asked questions. A Myvory delegate, not Pico, but an older female with a chipped shell, stood at the edge of the group and asked Russ what the smoke tasted like. Hard to describe. Russ said, slicing another portion. Warm, deep, a little sweet, a little bitter, like sitting next to a campfire. "I have never sat next to a fire," she said. "Well," Russ said gently, "you're next to one now." She stayed. The questions kept coming, and Russ answered every one. He talked about Earth's food cultures, not in a lecture, but the way someone talks about home when they miss it. He described Korean barbecue, how thin slices of marinated beef sizzled on a tabletop grill while friends passed side dishes back and forth. He talked about Argentine asado, whole animals slow-roasted over wood fires at family gatherings that lasted entire afternoons. South African braai, where the fire itself was part of the conversation. Jamaican jerk, rubbed with Scotch bonnet peppers and cooked over pimento wood until the spice got into your bones. On Earth, Russ said, food isn't just fuel. It's how we say I love you. It's how we say welcome. It's how we say you belong here. Asha, still standing beside him with rib sauce on her claws, looked up. "We had that once," she said softly. "The garrote. We had gathering fires." "I know," Russ said. "Duro told me." Across the hall, Duro had not moved from his seat, but his eyes had not left the station. Pico appeared at the edge of the crowd. He had been watching from a distance all morning, pacing, his legs tapping their endless, anxious rhythm. Now he pushed through the larger species and stood beside Russ's table. He looked at the ribs, the bones, the smoke still drifting upward. He did not eat, but he sat down on the floor next to Russ's chair, pulled his legs underneath himself, and said, "I think I understand now. It is not about the meat." Russ looked down at him. "It is about what the meat means," Pico said. Russ smiled. It was the first real smile anyone had seen from him all week. Not a polite one, not a patient one, a real one. "That's the whole point, Pico." The exhibition continued around them, but nobody was paying attention to the other stations anymore. The luminescent cakes sat untouched. The crystal towers chimed to an empty audience point 2 hours after the grand tasting began. Selene called an emergency session of the Summit Council. She stood before the floating seats with her translucent skin blazing with color, deep violet, the O'Reilly signal for outrage. She demanded sanctions against Earth. She demanded censure of every garrote delegate who had eaten at Russ's station. She called the event a violation of the summit's principles, a regression, a celebration of violence. She spoke for 20 minutes. She was eloquent, forceful, and absolutely certain she was right. Then Duro stood up. The old garrote had never spoken at a Summit Council session. In 15 years as a delegate, he had sat silently through every debate, every vote, every policy decision. His voice was not in the records. Some younger delegates didn't even know he could speak, that he spoke now. 50 years ago, Duro said, his rough voice filling the chamber, my people burned their smokehouses to earn your approval. We tore down stone buildings that our grandmothers built. We changed our children's meals and told them their hunger for meat was a sickness. We taught them shame. The chamber was silent. I was 6 years old when my grandmother gave me the last piece of roasted flank she would ever cook. She held me on her lap, and I ate, and she cried. I did not understand why she was crying. Duro paused. His tale was still. I understand now. He looked at Selani. One human with a smoker and a bag of wood just gave my people permission to remember who they are. You can call that barbarism if you want, but I call it mercy. He sat down. The chamber stayed silent for a long time. The council voted. The result was unanimous except for 2 abstentions. And O sanctions. No censure. No action. Selani stood very still for a moment. Then she walked out of the chamber without a word. The doors closed behind her with a soft hiss. In the exhibition hall below, the smoke was still rising. The exhibition hall was empty and the lights had been dimmed to a soft amber glow, but the smell of hickory smoke still hung in the air like it planned to stay forever. Russ sat on the floor beside his smoker, legs stretched out, back against the warm steel barrel. His hands were clean now, scrubbed with the last of his water supply, but the smoke scent clung to his skin and his clothes and probably his soul. Beside him, a crate sat open. Inside were bones. Every single bone from the rack, cracked, split, and emptied. Not a scrap of meat remained. Not a trace of marrow. He had finished every one that the cleaning could wait until morning. Right now, he was tired in the good way, the way a person gets after doing something that mattered. Footsteps. Like, quick, 6 of them. Pico appeared from behind a darkened food station, carrying a small ceramic bowl and 2 of his front legs. Steam rose from it in thin curls. I brought you something, Pico said. He held the bowl out carefully, like it was fragile. Mivory fungal broth. My people's version of comfort food, I think you would call it. Russ took the bowl. It was warm in his hands. The broth inside was pale gold with tiny flecks of something dark floating on the surface. You shared yours, Pico said. I wanted to share mine. Russ looked at the little Mivory for a long moment. Then he took a sip. The broth was earthy, mild, slightly sweet, like mushroom soup made by someone who actually knew what they were doing. That's good, Pico. That's really good. Pico's antennae straightened with pride. He settled onto the floor beside Russ, tucking his legs beneath his shell, and they sat together in the quiet. No words, just the fading warmth of the smoker and the taste of something freely given. 10 minutes passed before the next visitor arrived. Duro came through the main entrance, his heavy footsteps echoing in the empty hall. He carried a bottle, dark glass, no label, sealed with a wax cap that he cracked open with one claw. Garati Fire Brew, he said, sitting down on the other side of Russ with a grunt that shook the floor. We're not supposed to make this anymore either, but some of us never stopped. He poured a measure into the bottle cap and offered it to Russ. It smelled like black pepper and lightning. Russ drank it. His eyes watered. Duro made a sound that might have been a laugh. Then Asha came. She didn't bring food or drink. She brought a song. She stood in front of the 3 of them, the human, the Mivory, and the old Garati elder, and she sang. The words were in Old Garati, a dialect that hadn't been used publicly in 100 years. The melody was low and rhythmic, built for deep voices around a fire, and even though Russ couldn't understand the words, he felt them. It was a hunting song, a gathering song, a song about coming home with enough to feed everyone. When she finished, Duro's eyes were wet. He didn't wipe them. Others trickled in. A Bravani delegate, the silver-furred female, brought a story. She sat cross-legged on the floor and told them about her grandmother, who used to roast plains runners over open flame on the high steps of Bravana. The practice was outlawed when the Bravani joined the assembly. Her grandmother kept a single roasting spit hidden in her den until the day she died. She told me it wasn't about the meat, the Bravani said. It was about standing in the heat of the fire and knowing you could feed your family. She said that feeling was sacred. A Mivory scientist came. He didn't have a story, but he had a question. Do all humans eat together like this? Sitting on the ground? Sharing. When it matters, Russ said. Yeah, we do. The scientist sat down. He didn't eat. He didn't need to. Being there was enough. WY midnight. There were 20 beings on the floor of that exhibition hall. They sat in a rough circle around the cooling smoker. Garati, Bravani, Myvory, and one human. Someone had brought a light orb. It floated in the center like a small sun. Stories were being told. Old memories surfaced. Someone laughed. Someone else cried. A young Garati admitted he had never heard the hunting songs before tonight, and Asha taught him the first verse right there. Russ didn't give a speech. He didn't need to. He just kept the fire brew going, made sure everyone had a seat, and listened at some point. Pico leaned against Russ's arm. He was small enough that his shell barely reached Russ's elbow. Russ didn't move. He just let him stay. 3 weeks later, a galactic news broadcast ran a feature story. Across several worlds, species were quietly reopening old traditions. Garati communities were rebuilding smokehouses. Bravani families were teaching their children fire cooking. A Myvory commune had started holding communal meals, sitting together, eating at the same time, sharing conversation. It was the first time in their recorded history. The broadcast called it the Hadley Effect. Russ watched the broadcast from his porch back in Texas, a cold drink sweating in his hand, the evening air thick with the smell of fresh-cut grass. He smiled, shook his head, and turned off the screen. He had ribs to prep for Sunday, 6,000 light-years away, on a Garati colony world with twin orange suns. Duro stood in front of a newly built smokehouse. It was stone, like the ones his grandmothers had built. The mortar was still fresh. The chimney was still clean that he placed the first pieces of wood inside. Struck the flame. Watched it catch. Smoke rose into the alien sky, thin, blue-white, curling upward with no hurry at all. Duro closed his eyes. He breathed in deep, and in the warmth and the smell and the crackle of wood, he found her again. His grandmother. Her lap. The taste of roasted flank. The fire. Her tears that he remembered everything.